The harsh winds of the desert planet howled through the empty spaceport. Dust and sand whipped across the barren landscape, carried by the unrelenting storm. A lone mechanic stood by his battered ship, his hands covered in grease and his face smeared with exhaustion. It had been a long journey, and now his ship was stuck. The damage was too severe to fix without proper equipment, and the closest station was light years away. He kicked the dust, frustrated by his helplessness. The ship was more than a tool. It was his life. He had spent years fixing it, ensuring every piece was in perfect working order. But now it was nothing more than a pile of broken metal. The mechanic knew he had to make a decision: wait for rescue, or find a way to survive on this harsh world alone. Suddenly, the sky darkened, and a low rumble filled the air. The ground trembled beneath his boots, and he squinted up at the sky. A massive shadow passed overhead, blotting out the sun. At first, the mechanic thought it was just the storm playing tricks on his tired mind. But then, the roar of an engine reached his ears, growing louder with every passing second. Without thinking, he ran towards the source of the noise. His heart raced as the shadow grew larger. It wasn't a storm. It was a ship, a massive, sleek craft that seemed to defy the laws of physics as it descended towards the planet's surface. It had the unmistakable markings of royalty, a ship fit for a queen. The mechanic knew that the sight of such a vessel meant trouble, but something inside him urged him to get closer. As he neared the ship, it touched down with a heavy thud. The ground shook beneath him, and dust swirled into the air. The mechanic covered his face with his sleeve, trying to shield himself from the storm. The ship's engines powered down, leaving only the echo of silence. In the distance, he could hear the faint hiss of airlocks releasing. With a nervous glance, he approached the ship, feeling both fear and curiosity. The craft's sleek design was unlike anything he had ever seen. Alien, sophisticated, and far beyond his understanding. It was a marvel of technology. But what intrigued him most was the sense of urgency that radiated from it. The ship wasn't meant for peaceful travel. It was built for speed and power. The mechanic reached the entrance, unsure of what to expect. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should turn back. But a strange pull, an invisible force, drew him forward. He placed his hand on the door and it opened with a soft hiss. The interior was dimly lit, and a faint blue glow illuminated the ship's walls. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet. He crept forward, every step measured, as he surveyed his surroundings. The ship's corridors were vast, with high ceilings and strange symbols etched into the walls. Alien technology hummed around him, but there was no sign of life. It was as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Then he heard it, a soft groan, followed by a faint whisper. His heart skipped a beat as he realized someone was on board. He followed the sound, moving quickly but cautiously, until he came to a large chamber. There, lying against the wall, was an alien figure. A woman, though not human. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were closed. She was tall, with a regal presence that filled the room despite her weakened state. The mechanic's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, even in her unconscious state. He could see the faint outline of her silver armor, cracked and broken from the crash. Her long, flowing hair, once vibrant, was now matted with blood and dirt. But it was the aura around her that fascinated him. The power, the strength, and the overwhelming sense of royalty. He moved closer, his hands shaking as he examined the damage. Her breathing was shallow and there was a faint pulse, but it wasn't enough. The queen was on the brink of death. Panic surged through him. He wasn't a doctor, just a mechanic, but something inside him told him to act. He couldn't leave her here, alone, to die. There had to be something he could do. His eyes scanned the room for anything that could help. His gaze fell on a medical kit mounted to the wall nearby. He rushed over, his hands trembling as he grabbed the supplies. As he returned to her side, he hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. But there was no time to waste. He carefully began to tend to her wounds, trying to stabilize her as best he could. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he had. The queen stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. She let out a soft gasp, and her eyes opened, revealing glowing violet irises that seemed to pierce through the darkness. For a moment, they locked eyes, his wide with fear, hers with confusion and pain. Who are you? She whispered, her voice weak but still commanding. There was a power in her words that made his heart race. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I'm a mechanic, he stammered, his voice barely audible.
I found your ship. I thought you were in trouble.
The queen's gaze softened, though her eyes remained guarded. You saved me? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. He nodded, unsure of what to say. I couldn't just leave you. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Come with me, human. The mechanic froze, confused. What did she mean? Was she offering him a place on her ship? Or was it something else entirely? The queen's eyes glimmered as she closed her eyes again, her breathing steadier now. Though still labored, she had little strength left, but the words she had spoken held a deep meaning.
It was a request, or perhaps a command. He didn't know what to think.
A part of him wanted to walk away, to leave this strange, powerful creature behind and return to his broken ship. But another part of him, a part he couldn't ignore, was drawn to her. There was something about her, a mystery, a power that called to him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Whatever her request was, he knew he couldn't just turn back now. He had already crossed the point of no return. Where will we go? He asked, his voice firm with newfound determination. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile as she whispered, To the heart of my empire. And just like that, the mechanic's life changed forever. The queen was awake, though still weak. Her violet eyes flickered as she regarded the mechanic, studying him closely. She could tell he was still uncertain about his place here. He had done what many would have hesitated to do. He saved her life, and now the bond between them, however unexpected, had already begun. The mechanic had carefully stabilized her condition, but the damage to her ship was far from repaired. He knew he had a limited amount of time before they would need to leave this world and head toward the unknown. The Queen's empire wasn't just a distant memory. It was a place of immense importance, full of danger and ancient power. She had made the choice to bring him along, and though he hadn't fully understood why, something in her eyes told him he had been chosen for a reason. Who are you? The mechanic asked once more, though this time he asked with more curiosity than fear. The Queen had not yet shared anything beyond the basics of her state or her urgent mission. He could tell that she was the type to carry herself with both strength and grace, though a hidden sadness lurked behind her words. I am Caloreana, Empress of the Velith, she said, her voice softer now, but still commanding. The way she said her title made it clear that it was not just a name, but a responsibility she had carried for her entire life. I was born to rule, but my people have fallen. She winced as she tried to sit up. The mechanic quickly stepped forward, but she waved him off. She needed to regain her strength, and he could see it in the way she held her head high despite her physical weakness. There was a pride in her, an unspoken dignity that told him she was not one to show vulnerability. I never expected to be saved by a human, she continued, her tone reflecting a trace of awe. But you've done something no one else has. You fixed what was broken. The mechanic didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to receiving praise, let alone from someone of such importance. He cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on the tools he had been using to try and repair the ship. I'm just a mechanic. I didn't do much, really. Colorana's eyes softened. You did more than you realize. As the days passed, the mechanic worked tirelessly to repair the ship. Colorana would occasionally offer him insight into the ship's systems, though it was clear that her knowledge was limited to the more powerful aspects of the vessel, and she was still too weak to help much. Her people, the Veileth, had once been a great empire spanning across star systems and ruling with unmatched technology. But that was before the war, a war that had destroyed her empire and left her people scattered and broken. The mechanic learned that the Veileth had once ruled over countless planets, using their advanced technology to bring peace, though it was a peace achieved through control. They had used their knowledge of energy, space, and time to dominate, but at a great cost. Internal strife had torn the empire apart from within. Factions had risen, all vying for power, until finally the Queen's enemies had attacked her directly, sabotaging her ship and forcing her to flee. Colorana had been alone for weeks, with only her ship and the memories of her fallen empire to keep her company. The storm that had caused the crash had been a blessing, in a way. It had given her a chance to meet the mechanic, and, as unlikely as it seemed, he was the one who might just be able to help her reclaim what was lost. As she lay in her quarters, resting, the mechanic found himself thinking about her, about the woman who had not only survived such a terrible downfall, but had also managed to retain her dignity and willpower. She wasn't just a queen. She was a symbol of resilience, but even symbols needed help, and Colorana needed him. One evening, as the mechanic worked near the engine room, he overheard a conversation between the Queen and one of her automated drones. He couldn't understand everything, but he caught the part about rebuilding her forces and returning to the capital. The Queen had never directly mentioned what exactly she intended to do once they reached her empire, but the tone in her voice during those conversations hinted at something larger than just survival. He returned to his work, the sound of his tools clinking against metal echoing in the silence. The ship wasn't just a machine to him anymore. It had become a part of his purpose. He was fixing not just metal and circuits, but a broken legacy, a legacy that was now in his hands. The next day, Colorana approached him while he was working on the ship's main control panel. She moved with a certain grace, despite the exhaustion that still clung to her. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a strength that seemed to radiate outward.
"I need to ask something of you," she said, her voice low but firm. "You've helped me fix my ship, but there's more to be done."
"I need your help to rebuild my empire." The mechanic turned to face her, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been expecting this moment, though it still surprised him when it came. "I don't know much about empires," he replied, "but if you're asking me to stay and help you, I'll do what I can." Caloranana's eyes lit up, not with hope, but with something deeper, determination. "You don't need to know about empires, you just need to know that you are the key to my survival." The mechanic frowned, still unsure of what she meant. "But I'm just a mechanic. I can fix things, but I don't know anything about ruling or leading armies." Colorana stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You know how to fix what's broken. That's all that matters." Her words settled into his mind, leaving a lingering sense of unease. He wasn't sure if he was ready to be more than just a mechanic, but he couldn't ignore the pull she had on him. She had already saved him from his own solitude, and now, it seemed, he had to return the favor. As the days passed, the mechanic grew closer to Colorana, not just in proximity but in understanding. He began to realize that she wasn't asking for help simply because she needed a mechanic. She was asking for his loyalty. She was asking him to believe in her cause. One evening, as they stood together on the observation deck of her ship, watching the stars drift by, Colorana spoke again.
"You've seen the ruins of my people, the remnants of their once great empire.
But you must know this. They are not gone. My people live on, scattered across the galaxy. I intend to reunite them." The mechanic nodded, his heart pounding. "And I'm supposed to help you do that?" "You are more than just a mechanic," Colorana replied softly. You are the one who can help me rebuild what was lost." Her words held weight, heavy and true. He was no longer just a bystander. He was a part of something larger, something that might change the fate of a broken empire. But what would it cost him? And more importantly, what would he become in the process? The mechanic didn't have an answer, but as he looked out into the stars, he realized one thing. This was just the beginning. The ship hummed as it moved through space, cutting through the stars like a blade through the dark. The mechanic sat in his small quarters, staring at the wall, lost in thought. The vast emptiness of space seemed endless, yet he felt more trapped than ever. Kalarana's mission was clear. She was going to rebuild her empire. But what did that mean for him? A mechanic who had never been involved in anything more important than fixing ships and engines? Still, he had chosen to stay. And as the days passed, it became harder and harder to imagine leaving. There was something about the way Kalarana spoke, the way she looked at him, that kept him there. She didn't just need a mechanic. She needed someone who believed in her cause. But the mechanic knew little about empires, politics, or wars. Kalarana's people, the Valeth, had once ruled over entire star systems. Now they were scattered and fractured, vulnerable to the many factions that had risen in their wake. Their enemies were powerful and ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to ensure the Valeth never rose again. Kalarana had spent weeks teaching him about her people. She spoke of her ancestors, brave leaders who had built an empire that spanned across the stars. But even the mightiest empires had their weaknesses. The Valeth had fallen into a civil war, torn apart by greed, betrayal, and pride. Kalarana had been one of the last to survive. She had led her people with strength, but even she could not save them from their enemies. The sabotage of her ship, the loss of her fleet, everything had fallen apart in a matter of days. Kalarana's empire had crumbled. Now, she was trying to rebuild it, piece by piece. The mechanic's thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the ship's intercom.
It was Kalarana. She had summoned him to the bridge.
He stood up and made his way to the command center. The ship's halls were quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engines. As he entered the bridge, he saw Kalarana standing by the control panel, her back to him. She was watching the stars, her expression unreadable. "Come in," she said without turning. The mechanic stepped forward. "What's going on?" Kalarana's eyes met his, and for a moment he could see the weight of her thoughts in her gaze. "We are approaching the heart of my empire. The capital planet lies just ahead." The mechanic's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The place Kalarana had spoken of so often. The place where everything would either be rebuilt or destroyed.
He had no idea what to expect.
Would they face resistance? Would they find allies? Or would they be met by enemies who had already taken control of everything?
"How long until we arrive?"
He asked, trying to steady his nerves.
"A few hours," Kalarana replied, her voice low.
"But I fear what we will find when we land." The mechanic could sense the unease in her words. She was a queen. She had led armies, commanded fleets, yet even she was unsure of what lay ahead. "Do you think they'll be waiting for us?" the mechanic asked. Kalarana looked at him then, her expression softening. "I don't know. I hope not. But the Valeth are no longer the power they once were, and their enemies have only grown stronger. We cannot afford to fail."
The mechanic nodded.
"Then what's our plan?"
"We'll approach with caution,"
Kalarana said. "I have a few loyal supporters on the planet. They will help us when we land. But we need to be careful. If the enemy is already there, we'll have no choice but to fight."
The mechanic didn't respond right away.
He had never been in a real fight, at least not one like this. He had always been a fixer, someone who stayed in the background, keeping things running smoothly. But now he was being asked to step into the spotlight, to help rebuild an empire, and possibly to fight for its survival. Do you trust them? He asked. Kalorana's eyes darkened.
I trust no one completely, Mr.
But I have no other choice. The ship glided through the stars, the tension on the bridge thickening with every passing minute. The mechanic couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision he had made. He had chosen to stay by Kalorana's side, to follow her on this journey. But what if he wasn't enough? What if the war they were about to face was more than he could handle? As they neared the capital planet, the ship's sensors began to pick up strange readings. Kalorana immediately moved to the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she scanned the data. "There's something wrong?" she muttered. The mechanic stepped closer.
What is it? There's a fleet.
Kalorana said, her voice tight.
A fleet that's not ours.
They've already arrived. And they're waiting for us.
A cold feeling gripped the mechanic's stomach. The enemy had beaten them to it. Kalorana quickly began issuing orders, her voice calm despite the tension. Prepare the ship for battle.
We'll need to make our way through their defenses. Set a course for the capital city. The mechanic didn't hesitate. He moved quickly to his station, checking the systems to ensure they were ready for whatever lay ahead.
He wasn't a soldier, but he had learned enough in the past few weeks to know that the survival of their mission depended on their ability to move quickly and decisively. As the ship prepared for battle, Kalorana turned to him one last time. Are you ready? The mechanic looked at her, and for the first time he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure either, but in that moment, something inside him stirred. It was more than just fear. It was a sense of duty, of responsibility.
Yes,
He said quietly.
I'm ready.
The ship surged forward, its engines roaring to life as it rocketed toward the capital. The fleet that had arrived before them loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Kalorana's enemies were here, and there was no turning back. The mechanic's hands gripped the control panel as he prepared for the fight of his life. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was part of something much bigger, and the galaxy, for better or worse, was about to see what they could do. The ship shook as it entered the atmosphere of the capital planet, its engines groaning under the strain. The mechanic braced himself as the controls rattled beneath his hands. Kalorana stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the view screen, her expression unreadable. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of their journey pressing down on them both. They had made it this far, but the real challenge was just beginning. The mechanic could see the planet's surface below, a sprawling city surrounded by ruins and broken walls. Once, it had been a thriving capital, filled with the splendor of the Valeth Empire. Now, it was a shadow of its former glory, a place where enemies fought for control, and the hope of rebuilding seemed impossible. Kalorana's people had been scattered, lost to time and war, but she had returned, determined to reclaim what was hers. "This is it," the mechanic said, his voice low. He could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what they were about to face. Kalorana nodded but said nothing. Her eyes were focused, determined. She had already faced so much: betrayal, loss, and failure. Now, she was about to face the remnants of her empire's enemies. There was no turning back. As the ship descended toward the city, the mechanic scanned the systems, ensuring everything was in order. He wasn't sure what they would find when they landed. Would there be allies waiting for them? Or would they be met by those who had taken control of the planet, ready to fight for what they believed was theirs? The landing was smooth, but the quiet tension on the ship was palpable. Kalorana stood, her posture straight, as she looked at the mechanic. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The mechanic hesitated for a moment, his thoughts racing. He had never been part of a battle like this. He was a mechanic, not a soldier, but he had chosen to stay with her, to follow her on this journey. And now, it was time to see it through. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. I'm ready. Kalorana gave him a small nod. Before turning toward the hatch, the mechanic followed her, and together they stepped onto the surface of the capital planet. The ground was cold beneath their boots, and the air smelled of dust and decay. The city before them was eerily quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath. They moved forward, the sounds of their footsteps echoing in the silence. Kalorana led the way, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she walked. The mechanic stayed close behind, his eyes darting around, aware of every movement. He knew that danger could be lurking at any corner. As they reached the center of the city, they saw the first signs of life, figures moving in the distance cloaked in shadows. Kalorana stopped, signaling for the mechanic to stay low. They moved carefully, using the broken buildings for cover, until they reached the heart of the capital. There, a group of armed soldiers stood guard, their eyes scanning the area. Kalorana's face tightened with recognition. These were not the soldiers of her people, but the soldiers of her enemies, the ones who had taken control of her empire. The mechanic could see the anger in her eyes, but there was also a determination. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. We'll need to get past them, she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with tension. The mechanic nodded, his mind racing. He wasn't sure how they were going to make it through this, but he knew one thing. Kalorana wasn't going to stop until she had what was hers, and he wasn't going to let her do it alone. They waited for the right moment, watching the soldiers' movements, looking for an opening. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. The sound of footsteps approaching made the mechanic's heart race, but Kalorana didn't flinch. She had learned to be patient, to wait for the perfect moment. And finally, it came. With a swift motion, Kalorana leaped forward, moving with the speed and grace of someone who had fought battles her entire life. The mechanic followed her lead, his body reacting instinctively as he dodged past the soldiers and grabbed one by the arm, pulling him to the ground. There was a brief struggle, but the mechanic had the element of surprise. He quickly subdued the soldier, and the others, momentarily distracted, turned their attention to Kalorana. She didn't hesitate. With a fluid motion, she disarmed the first soldier and moved to the next, taking him down with ease. The mechanic followed, doing what he could to help, but it was clear that Kalorana was the one in control. Her strength, her power, it was something beyond anything he had ever seen. She wasn't just a queen, she was a warrior. They fought their way through the soldiers, their path clear for the moment, but they knew it wouldn't last. More enemies were coming, and they had to move quickly.
We need to get to the control room, Kalorana said, her voice steady but urgent. It's where the heart of the Empire's power lies. The mechanic nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. They continued forward, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder. It wouldn't be long before they were surrounded, but they couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. As they reached the entrance to the control room, they were met by more soldiers, this time armed with more advanced weapons. The mechanic could feel the weight of the situation. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But Kalorana didn't flinch. She moved with a confidence that was almost terrifying, her eyes focused on the goal ahead. They won't stop us, she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. The mechanic stood beside her, ready to face whatever came next. He wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, he knew one thing. He was in this for the long haul. No matter what happened, he would stand by her side. As the doors to the control room opened, Kalorana stepped forward, her face a mask of determination. The mechanic followed, his heart racing. Inside, he saw what he had feared, an army of soldiers, led by a figure he knew all too well. It was her brother, the one who had betrayed her, the one who had taken control of the Empire. Kalorana's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. She had come to take back what was hers, but now she faced the one person who had helped destroy everything she had built. There's no place for you here, Kalorana,
her brother said, his voice cold. Your time is over. Kalorana didn't say a word. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. The mechanic could see the fury in her eyes, but there was something else there too, a sense of finality. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She raised her hand, and the power of her people surged through her. Energy crackled in the air as she unleashed everything she had. Her brother tried to fight back, but it was too late. Kalorana's power was unstoppable. The room was filled with a bright light, and when it faded, only silence remained. Kalorana stood, her chest rising and falling with exertion. She had won, but at what cost? She turned to the mechanic, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. It's over, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The mechanic nodded, his heart heavy. They had rebuilt what was broken, but the price of their victory had been steep. Kalorana had sacrificed so much to get here, and now the Empire was hers once again. But as she looked out over the control room, the mechanic could see the toll it had taken on her. She had regained her power, but she had lost so much in the process. And as the stars stretched out before them, the mechanic knew that their journey was far from over. They had won the battle, but the war was still ahead. And together they would face whatever came next.